People only notice a dumpster when they think no one they love will ever have to stand beside one. The security lights behind the Whole Foods flickered against the damp pavement as Danielle Brooks adjusted the worn knit cap over her dark curls and pulled a pair of faded work gloves tighter around her trembling hands. It was nearly 10:30 on a Thursday night, late enough that the loading dock had gone quiet except for the distant hum of refrigeration units and the occasional hiss of passing traffic. Her 6-year-old son, Micah, sat on an upside-down milk crate several yards away, bundled inside an oversized blue coat that had once belonged to a neighbor's grandson. He hugged his backpack against his chest, swinging his sneakers just above the cracked asphalt. Danielle had given him only one rule. Keep looking at the stars if you can find them. Don't look over here. The little boy obeyed without complaint. Children learn strange routines when survival quietly replaced childhood. Danielle lifted the heavy plastic lid and paused as the familiar mix of cold air and discarded groceries drifted upward. She never rushed. She never tore open bags carelessly. She searched with the same precision she once used balancing inventory sheets back when she had a steady office job before the company downsized and the childcare costs swallowed every paycheck that followed. She looked only for sealed packages, untouched produce, cartons with tomorrow's date printed across the top. Anything questionable stayed behind. Whatever dignity remained in this ritual depended on rules no one else could see. Across the narrow street, 43 floors above the city, Adrian Cole stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Cole Market Holdings' executive offices. The quarterly meeting had ended nearly an hour earlier. Most of the board had already disappeared into waiting town cars, leaving behind polished conference tables, untouched bottled water, and slides celebrating another record quarter. Adrian loosened his tie without taking his eyes off the glowing skyline. Chicago stretched endlessly beneath him, a landscape of glass reflecting glass. Then something below caught his attention. A single figure moved carefully behind the Whole Foods flagship store. At first he assumed it was an employee finishing a late shift. Then he noticed the woman carefully lifting sealed containers from a dumpster, inspecting each one beneath the yellow security light before placing a few inside a reusable canvas bag. His hand stopped halfway to his coffee mug. She wasn't stealing. She wasn't making a mess. She looked almost practiced. His eyes shifted to the small boy waiting nearby. The child wasn't crying or complaining. He simply watched passing airplanes, occasionally glancing toward his mother with quiet trust. Adrian felt something unfamiliar settle uncomfortably inside his chest. He had reviewed reports all afternoon discussing food waste percentages, liability exposure, disposal compliance, and brand protection. Every chart had looked clean. Every policy had sounded reasonable. None of them had mentioned a little boy waiting beside a loading dock while his mother searched through discarded groceries. Danielle smiled softly when she found an unopened container of strawberries, still bright beneath the plastic lid. She brushed away a drop of condensation with the sleeve of her sweatshirt before slipping it carefully into her bag. "Did you find the red ones?" Micah called without turning around. "I think I did," she answered, keeping her voice light. "Maybe tomorrow we'll have enough for pancakes too." "Can we save some for Mrs. Alvarez upstairs?" he asked. Danielle closed her eyes for the briefest second before smiling again. Even now, after weeks of stretching every dollar until it disappeared, her son still thought about the elderly widow who often shared stories through the apartment hallway. "If we have enough," she replied gently. "We'll always share if we can." Adrian watched the exchange through silent glass. He expected bitterness. He expected anger. Instead, he saw kindness surviving in a place where it had no logical reason to exist. He glanced back toward the financial presentation still glowing faintly across the conference room monitor. One bullet point remained frozen on the screen. Waste disposal compliance, 99.8%. For the first time in years, the number didn't look like success. It looked incomplete. Below, Danielle zipped her canvas bag closed and reached for Micah's hand. The little boy smiled the moment their fingers met, as though his mother had returned carrying treasure instead of tomorrow's breakfast rescued from yesterday's excess. Neither of them noticed the man watching from the tower across the street. But long after they disappeared into the darkness beyond the parking lot, Adrian remained standing at the window, unable to convince himself that what he had just witnessed belonged outside someone else's life. Danielle Brooks woke before the alarm because hunger always seemed to arrive a few minutes before morning. The apartment was still dark except for the faint orange glow leaking through the blinds from the parking lot outside. The old radiator clicked unevenly, trying harder than it succeeded, and somewhere down the hallway a neighbor's coffee maker hummed to life. She lay still for a moment, listening to Micah's slow breathing from the small bed across the room. That sound had become the closest thing she had to peace. As long as he was sleeping, he was not asking whether there would be enough cereal left or whether they could buy milk this week. She quietly slipped out of bed and opened the refrigerator. Inside sat half a carton of eggs rescued the night before, the unopened strawberries, a small bottle of ketchup, and a pitcher of tap water. She smiled when she saw the strawberries again. To someone else they might have looked like leftovers. To Micah they would feel like Saturday. She washed each berry carefully under cold water before slicing them into thin pieces so they would fill 2 plates instead of 1. Micah wandered into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. His smile appeared the moment he saw the fruit. "You really found them," he whispered. Danielle nodded as though she had expected nothing less. "I told you I would try." The boy climbed onto his chair and folded his hands automatically before breakfast. "Can we thank God for the people who forgot these?" he asked. Danielle lowered her head, but her throat tightened before any words came. "Yes," she finally answered softly. "And we can thank him for another morning together." After breakfast, she walked Micah 3 blocks to school, his small backpack bouncing gently against his shoulders while he talked excitedly about the paper rocket his class planned to build that afternoon. Danielle listened carefully, asking questions she already knew the answers to because she wanted him to feel that his dreams still deserved full attention even when her own mind kept returning to overdue bills. Once he disappeared through the school doors, she unfolded the envelope she had been carrying inside her coat pocket. The notice from her landlord was printed in plain black letters. Rent overdue. 7 days remaining before additional legal action. She folded it again before anyone walking past could accidentally read it. Her phone vibrated almost immediately afterward. Another reminder from the pharmacy informed her that Micah's asthma inhaler refill had been waiting for 3 days. Total due after insurance, $48.60. She stared at the number for several seconds before placing the phone back into her pocket. $48 had once been dinner with friends after work. Now it stood between her son and the medicine that helped him breathe through cold nights. By 8 o'clock, she had already arrived at the neighborhood laundromat, where she worked mornings folding clothes for customers who rarely noticed the woman returning every perfectly matched pair of socks. Danielle enjoyed the work because it rewarded patience instead of speed. She folded every shirt neatly, smoothed every towel, and quietly stitched loose buttons whenever she found them, even though nobody paid her for those extra minutes. "You always do more than you have to," her manager, Mrs. Franklin, often reminded her. Danielle simply smiled. Sometimes little things keep people going longer than we realize. Near lunchtime, Mrs. Franklin approached, carrying an apologetic expression Danielle had learned to recognize. "I hate to ask this," she began, "but business has slowed again this week. I have to cut everyone's hours." Danielle nodded before the explanation finished. She had practiced accepting disappointment without making the person delivering it feel guilty. "How many?" she asked. "2 shifts." Mrs. Franklin looked down at her clipboard. "Maybe 3. Danielle thanked her anyway. Walking home later that afternoon, she stopped outside the utility office long enough to read another notice taped to the entrance. Payment plans were available only before final disconnection. She checked her wallet. $23. A bus pass. 2 quarters. Nothing else. The math refused to change no matter how many times she counted. That evening, Micah spread construction paper across the tiny kitchen table while Danielle carefully mended a tear in his winter coat using dark blue thread almost identical to the original stitching. "Mrs. Alvarez says superheroes always fix things," Micah said as he colored a bright red cape onto his paper rocket. Danielle smiled without looking up. "Real superheroes usually fix small things first." The little boy considered that seriously before nodding. Outside, the temperature continued falling. Inside, Danielle quietly calculated rent, medicine, groceries, electricity, and childcare once again, knowing the numbers would still refuse to fit together tomorrow. Yet before turning off the light that night, she placed the remaining strawberries into a small plastic container for Micah's lunch because even in a life measured by impossible choices, she refused to let her son believe that kindness, beauty, and hope were luxuries meant only for other families. The following afternoon, the sky hung low over the neighborhood, wrapped in thick gray clouds that threatened rain without ever making a promise. Danielle arrived at Lincoln Elementary 10 minutes early because being late meant Micah would worry long before she reached the front office. She stood just beyond the chain-link fence, smiling as children poured out carrying oversized backpacks and construction paper projects that flapped wildly in the autumn wind. Micah spotted her immediately, waving a paper rocket high above his head as though she might somehow miss him in the crowd. "Mom, look," he shouted, running carefully instead of recklessly because she had spent years teaching him that excitement did not have to outrun kindness. She knelt to meet him halfway. The bright red rocket was covered with silver stars cut from aluminum foil. Across the center his teacher had written, "Reach higher." Danielle admired it as though it belonged in a museum. "I think this one might fly all the way to the moon," she whispered. Micah grinned proudly before slipping his small hand into hers. They stopped at the neighborhood library where the afternoon warmth welcomed anyone. The rain finally arrived just before sunrise, tapping softly against Adrian Cole's office windows as another day of meetings filled the calendar on the tablet resting beside his coffee. Usually he began every morning the same way, reviewing sales reports before anyone else reached the executive floor. Revenue trends, inventory loss, regional performance. Numbers had always made sense because numbers never cried, never hesitated, and never looked back at him with tired eyes beneath a loading dock security light. Today he reached the fourth page of the weekly operations report before realizing he had not read a single line. His mind kept returning to the woman who had given away food she could barely afford to lose. He pressed the intercom. "Laura, could you bring me the food waste compliance report for all Chicago locations?" There was a brief pause before his assistant answered. "The summary or the full audit?" Adrian stared out the rain-speckled glass toward the flagship store across the street. "The full audit." 15 minutes later, a thick binder landed on his desk. Laura looked mildly surprised. Most executives only review the summaries. Adrian offered a distracted smile. Maybe that has been the problem. After she left, he opened the binder and began reading. Every discarded item was documented with remarkable precision. Yogurt approaching its sell-by date. Bread baked that morning but unsold by evening. Produce with minor cosmetic imperfections. Prepared meals removed according to company policy. Every page ended with the same reassuring sentence. Disposal completed according to corporate risk management guidelines. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Everything looked responsible. Yet all Adrian could see was a little boy smiling because his mother had found strawberries someone else had thrown away. He closed the binder and opened another folder he had not touched in years. Inside rested a faded photograph of himself at about 8 years old standing beside his grandmother outside a small neighborhood grocery store in Detroit. She was laughing while holding a brown paper bag against her hip. Adrian remembered that day with uncomfortable clarity. The owner of the store had quietly handed his grandmother bruised peaches that could not be sold but were still perfectly good. She accepted them with gratitude, never with shame, and later she turned them into the sweetest cobbler he had ever tasted. "Nothing honest should make you feel small," she used to tell him whenever life became difficult. Somewhere between building a billion-dollar company and protecting shareholders, he had stopped asking whether perfectly good food could still carry hope after it left a shelf. His grandmother had understood the answer long before any policy manual existed. Mid-morning brought the executive operations meeting. Charts appeared across the large conference screen while department heads discussed shrink percentages and legal exposure. One vice president proudly announced that disposal compliance had reached another company record. Several people around the table nodded with satisfaction. Adrian did not. "How much edible food are we throwing away each week in Chicago alone?" he asked quietly. The room fell still. The operations director glanced toward the legal department before answering. "Approximately 38,000 pounds, depending on seasonal inventory." Adrian folded his hands. "And how much of it is unsafe to eat?" Another silence followed. "Not all of it is unsafe," someone admitted carefully. "Most of it is removed because once products leave our control, liability becomes difficult to manage." Adrian nodded slowly. but no one mistook the movement for agreement. The conversation continued, yet he barely heard the rest. Every explanation sounded logical. Every policy had a reason. Every decision protected the company. Still, somewhere outside those polished conference walls, mothers searched through dumpsters because people like him had accepted that protecting food mattered more than protecting dignity. Late that afternoon, Adrian left the building without calling for his driver. He walked alone beneath a gray umbrella through streets crowded with office workers rushing toward warm restaurants and commuter trains. When he reached the alley behind the flagship store, he stopped several yards from the loading dock. The dumpsters stood exactly where they had every night before. They looked ordinary now, almost invisible against the brick wall. An employee wheeled out another cart stacked with sealed containers destined for disposal. Adrian watched quietly as each package disappeared beneath heavy plastic lids. The employee never questioned the task because following policy had become routine. Adrian realized that was exactly how mistakes survived, not through cruelty, but through habit. As he turned to leave, his eyes settled on a single unopened container resting near the top before the lid closed. It looked almost identical to the strawberries Danielle had carried home. For the first time in many years, the weight Adrian felt was not the pressure of leading a corporation. It was the far heavier burden of recognizing that some of the suffering he had witnessed had been quietly signed into existence with his own approval long before he ever saw the people living beneath the consequences. Saturday morning arrived with unexpected sunshine, the kind that made old brick buildings glow warmer than they really were. Danielle buttoned Micah's jacket carefully before they left the apartment. Smoothing the collar with the same quiet attention she gave every small thing she still had the power to protect. They walked 3 blocks to the neighborhood park because weekends cost less when the weather cooperated. Micah raced toward the swings carrying his paper rocket from school, now slightly bent at one corner after several imaginary trips to the moon. Danielle settled onto a weathered wooden bench with a library book she never opened. Instead, she watched her son laugh each time the swing carried him higher. She had learned long ago that joy deserved full attention because it rarely announced how long it planned to stay. Across town, Adrian canceled 2 meetings that had been scheduled for weeks. Laura stared at him in surprise as he picked up his coat instead of another report. "Should I reschedule the investor call?" she asked. Adrian nodded. "Tell them something more important came up." It was the first time he had ever used those words without referring to a merger, a lawsuit, or a financial emergency. 20 minutes later, he entered one of the smaller Whole Foods locations wearing a plain navy jacket instead of his usual tailored suit. Only the store manager recognized him immediately. "Mr. Cole," the manager said nervously. "We were not expecting a visit." Adrian smiled politely. "That is exactly why I came." He walked slowly through every department instead of heading directly to the office. He watched employees rotate fresh produce, remove bakery items from display shelves, and replace prepared meals that still looked perfectly edible. None of the workers questioned the routine because every movement followed a handbook they had been trained to trust. Near the back of the store, Adrian stopped beside a rolling cart already filled with packaged salads, sandwiches, fruit cups, and soup containers waiting to be discarded. "Where does all of this go?" he asked. The assistant manager answered immediately. "Disposal bins, sir. Company policy." Adrian picked up a sealed container of chicken noodle soup and checked the label. The sell-by date was not until the following afternoon. "Would you eat this today?" The young manager hesitated before answering honestly. "Yes, sir." Adrian placed the container back onto the cart. "Then why are we throwing it away?" The manager shifted uneasily. "Because we always have." The simplicity of the answer settled heavily between them. No one had acted out of malice. No one had made an independent decision. Habit had quietly replaced judgment. Later that afternoon, Adrian requested detailed records from every Chicago location showing exactly how much edible food had been discarded during the previous 6 months. His legal department responded within the hour with a memorandum outlining liability concerns and potential public relations risks if donation programs were expanded. He read every page carefully before setting the document aside. For years, those arguments had seemed complete. Now they felt strangely unfinished because none of them contained the names of the people living outside the spreadsheets. As evening approached, Danielle and Micah stopped by Mrs. Alvarez's apartment, carrying a small loaf of banana bread Danielle had baked using 2 overripe bananas rescued earlier that week. The elderly woman smiled with genuine delight. You should have kept this for yourselves, she protested gently. Danielle laughed softly. Bread tastes better when someone else smiles first. Micah proudly handed over the loaf with both hands. Mrs. Alvarez disappeared into her tiny kitchen and returned carrying a folded envelope. The church gave me 2 bus passes that I cannot use anymore, she explained. My knees are not what they used to be. Danielle immediately began shaking her head. You should save them. The older woman reached forward and tucked the envelope into Danielle's coat pocket before she could refuse. Sometimes accepting kindness lets someone else keep theirs. Danielle looked down for a long moment before quietly whispering, "Thank you." Walking home beneath the golden light of sunset, Micah slipped his hand into hers. People helped each other today, he said with the simple certainty only children seemed able to carry. Danielle smiled toward the fading sky. That is how tomorrow begins. At almost the same moment, Adrian stood alone in his office reviewing the disposal reports that had finally arrived. The total covered several pages, but one number refused to leave his thoughts. In just 6 months, the company's Chicago stores had discarded enough edible food to provide hundreds of thousands of meals. He slowly closed the folder and looked across the street toward the alley behind the flagship store where everything had begun to change. For the first time since building his company, Adrian understood that success could no longer be measured only by everything his business managed to sell. It also had to answer for everything it chose to throw away. Monday morning began with a silence that felt unusually heavy. Danielle noticed it the moment she stepped behind the Whole Foods loading dock after dropping Micah at school. The familiar dumpsters stood exactly where they always had, but thick steel chains now wrapped around every lid, secured with bright new padlocks that reflected the pale morning sun. A freshly laminated sign hung from the fence nearby. Authorized personnel only. Violators will be prosecuted. Danielle stood motionless for several seconds, her canvas bag slipping slowly from her shoulder until it rested against her leg. She had never broken a lock. She had never climbed a fence. She had only gathered what everyone else had already decided no longer mattered. Yet somehow the alley felt as though it had been closed specifically against people like her. She quietly turned away before anyone inside the store could see the disappointment on her face. That afternoon, another letter waited beneath her apartment door. The electric company had approved no further extensions. Payment was due within 48 hours. She folded the notice carefully and placed it beside the rent reminder already resting on the kitchen counter. 2 pieces of paper now occupied more space in her thoughts than all the furniture in the apartment. Micah wandered into the kitchen carrying a worksheet from school covered in carefully printed spelling words. My teacher says I read faster now, he announced proudly. Danielle smiled with genuine warmth despite the weight pressing against her chest. I knew you would. He climbed onto his chair and noticed the unopened pharmacy receipt lying beside the sink. Do we still have to pick up my medicine? He asked quietly. Danielle reached over and tucked the receipt beneath a cookbook before answering. Soon. She hated how quickly children learn the difference between later and soon. Across the city, Adrian walked into the weekly executive strategy meeting carrying a thin folder instead of the usual stack of reports. The legal department, operations executives, and regional directors filled the conference room. He waited until everyone settled before speaking. I want to begin transferring safe surplus food from our Chicago stores to local community organizations instead of destroying it. The room remained silent for only a heartbeat before objections arrived from every direction. The chief legal officer adjusted her glasses. The liability exposure alone could be enormous. The operations director added, distribution costs would erase part of our efficiency gains. Another executive leaned forward. Investors will ask why we are changing a system that already works. Adrian listened without interrupting. Months earlier, he would have agreed with every argument. Today, they sounded strangely familiar, as though he had already heard them whispered by every locked dumpster in the city. It works, he answered calmly. Only if you never ask who is standing outside the system. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. The meeting ended without a decision. Instead, Adrian was informed that any policy change of that scale required formal approval from the board and a complete legal review. Progress had not been rejected. It had simply been buried beneath procedures capable of delaying change for months. Late that afternoon, Adrian requested surveillance footage from the flagship store covering the previous week. The security manager hesitated but complied. Adrian watched the recordings alone. There she was again, Danielle arriving after dark, wearing the same worn gloves, checking every package with quiet care, giving away food to an older man, leaving the alley cleaner than she found it, never once damaging property or taking anything that had not already been discarded. The footage lasted less than 20 minutes, yet Adrian replayed it twice. The woman outside his store displayed more respect for the food than the corporation throwing it away. That evening, Danielle stopped by the pharmacy, hoping someone might offer another extension. The pharmacist greeted her kindly, but shook his head with genuine regret. "I am sorry," he said softly. "The system will not let me release prescription medication until the balance is paid." Danielle thanked him anyway because frustration directed at a kind person never made life easier. As she stepped back onto the sidewalk, cold wind swept between the buildings. She wrapped her coat tighter and looked toward the grocery store several blocks away before quietly changing direction. There was no reason to visit the alley anymore. The chains had already answered every question she might have asked. High above the city lights, Adrian stood once again beside the window that had changed everything. He could no longer pretend he had merely witnessed another stranger's hardship. Now he understood something far more uncomfortable. The locks hanging from those dumpsters had not been installed by cruel people. They had been installed by responsible employees following responsible policies created inside responsible boardrooms. And somewhere between responsibility and routine, compassion had simply been left outside the gate. Wednesday arrived carrying the sharp bite of early November, and with it came the kind of cold that settled into old apartment walls long before winter officially began. Danielle woke to find the radiator completely silent. She turned the valve twice, then rested her hand against the metal pipe, hoping warmth might still be making its slow journey through the building. Nothing came. She quietly pulled another blanket over Micah before slipping into the kitchen. The electric bill still rested beneath the cookbook exactly where she had hidden it 2 days earlier, but hiding paper never postponed deadlines. Her phone vibrated with an incoming call from the landlord. She answered before the second ring. "Miss Brooks," he said with a tired but not unkind voice. "I wanted to let you know the maintenance crew will be checking apartments next week. I also need to ask about the rent." Danielle closed her eyes briefly. "I know. I am trying." There was a pause. "I believe you," he replied softly. "But believing does not stop the mortgage either." After the call ended, she remained standing beside the sink for several moments before taking a slow breath and forcing herself to smile as Micah wandered into the room rubbing his sleepy eyes. "Is it cold because winter is coming?" he asked. Danielle knelt to zip his jacket before breakfast. "Maybe winter is just reminding us to stay close together." At school that afternoon, Micah's teacher gently stopped Danielle before she reached the hallway. "He has been coughing more during recess," she said quietly. "The nurse mentioned his inhaler is almost empty." Danielle thanked her, promising she would take care of it, though both women could hear the uncertainty hidden beneath the words. On the walk home, Micah reached into his backpack and carefully pulled out a folded drawing. It showed a tiny apartment beneath a bright yellow sun. 2 figures stood holding hands outside the front door. "That is us," he explained proudly. Danielle smiled. "Who is the big one?" "You. And why am I smiling so much?" Micah looked surprised by the question. "Because you always do when you look at me." Danielle swallowed the tightness growing in her throat and folded the picture with extraordinary care before placing it inside her purse. Across the city, Adrian sat through another board committee meeting that felt longer than any he could remember. The legal review had already begun circulating among directors, and several members made their positions unmistakably clear. "Food donation programs create unpredictable exposure," one director insisted. "Even if intentions are good, shareholders expect stability, not experiments." Another added, "Changing policy because of isolated emotional incidents is dangerous leadership." Adrian remained silent until everyone else had finished speaking. Then he looked around the polished conference table. "When did we decide that people become isolated incidents simply because they are poor?" The room fell quiet. No one answered immediately. Instead, one board member leaned back and folded his arms. "If you push this through without consensus, you will own every consequence." Adrian met his gaze without hesitation. "That is exactly the point. I already do." The meeting ended without resolution, but the message was unmistakable. Several directors privately warned Laura afterward that Adrian's position could become increasingly fragile if he continued challenging long-established policies. Late that evening, Adrian left the office carrying no briefcase, only the folded photograph of himself and his grandmother that he had slipped into his coat pocket earlier that morning. He walked without destination until he found himself outside the small neighborhood where Danielle lived. He never approached her building. He never knocked on her door. Instead, he stood across the street watching children play beneath flickering apartment lights while parents hurried home carrying grocery bags, laundry baskets, and tired shoulders. It struck him that every family here fought battles invisible from the windows of corporate headquarters. As he turned to leave, he noticed Danielle emerging from the corner pharmacy with empty hands. She paused beneath the streetlight, looked at the closed receipt in her fingers, then quietly tucked it into her pocket before continuing toward home. She never cried. She never raised her voice. She simply walked with the steady determination of someone refusing to let disappointment arrive before she reached her son. Adrian remained where he was long after she disappeared into the building. For days he had searched for the right policy, the right legal strategy, the right corporate solution. Standing alone beneath the cold evening sky, he finally understood something much simpler. Before he could change an entire system, he would first have to earn the trust of the one woman who had already spent far longer than he had living with the consequences of it. And he knew with complete certainty that trust could never be purchased. It could only be deserved. The invitation arrived on thick white paper, slipped beneath Danielle's apartment door, without any company logo on the envelope. Inside was a simple letter requesting her presence at a public community listening session being held by Coal Market Holdings regarding food waste and neighborhood partnerships. There was no promise of money, no mention of charity, and no explanation beyond one handwritten sentence at the bottom. Your voice matters more than any report I have ever read. Signed, Adrian Cole. Danielle read the letter twice before placing it quietly beside Micah's drawing of the little apartment beneath the bright yellow sun. Her first instinct was to throw the invitation away. She had spent enough of her life being observed by people who wanted to understand poverty without ever sharing its weight. But that evening, as she tucked Micah into bed, he looked up at her with sleepy eyes and asked, "Do grown-ups ever fix mistakes?" Danielle smoothed the blanket around his shoulders before answering. "The brave ones try." Those words remained with her long after he fell asleep. 2 days later, she stepped into the community center wearing her only navy cardigan, its cuffs carefully repaired with tiny stitches almost impossible to notice. The room was filled with neighborhood leaders, food pantry volunteers, store managers, employees, and several members of the company's executive team. Adrian stood near the front without a podium, without a spotlight, and without the polished confidence that usually followed him into boardrooms. He looked more like a man carrying responsibility than authority. When the discussion opened, experts spoke first. Lawyers discussed regulations. Consultants presented statistics. Executives described logistical challenges. Every explanation sounded thoughtful, complete, and carefully prepared. Danielle listened quietly until the moderator asked whether anyone from the community wished to speak. The room fell still. She slowly stood, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her cardigan before walking to the microphone. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice did not. "I do not know much about policies," she began. "I only know what my son sees." The room became perfectly silent. "He thinks strawberries are special because sometimes they appear after someone else decides they are no longer worth keeping. He thanks God for food that other people throw away because he has never learned to expect more. Every night, I try to make sure he never saw me searching through those dumpsters because I wanted him to grow up believing that being poor should never mean being ashamed." Several people lowered their eyes. Danielle continued without anger, without accusation. "When the dumpsters were locked, I understood why. Rules exist for reasons. But I kept wondering whether anyone who wrote those rules had ever stood where I was standing. I am not asking anyone to rescue me. I am asking whether we can build something that does not require another mother to choose between her dignity and feeding her child." She stepped away from the microphone before anyone applauded. She had not come to deliver a speech. She had only told the truth. Adrian remained silent for several moments after she returned to her seat. Then he walked slowly to the front of the room, holding a single folder instead of the stack of prepared remarks waiting beside the stage. "Everything Mrs. Brooks said is true," he began quietly. "And part of that truth belongs to me." A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. "Years ago, I approved policies that protected this company from legal risk. Those policies also created consequences I never bothered to see. That failure is mine." He opened the folder and removed a signed document. "Effective immediately, I am recommending the suspension of our current disposal policy in every Chicago location while we launch partnerships with certified food recovery organizations. I have also informed the board that if someone must answer for the financial and legal risks involved, it will be me." Several executives shifted uneasily. One board member stood and quietly left the room. Adrian noticed, but did not stop speaking. Leadership does not mean protecting a title. It means accepting the cost of correcting your own mistakes. When the meeting ended, reporters waiting outside called Adrian's name, but he did not answer their questions first. Instead, he walked toward Danielle, stopping several feet away to respect the boundary she had earned long before he deserved to cross it. "Thank you," he said simply. Danielle looked at him for a long moment before gently shaking her head. "Do not thank me yet." Her eyes drifted toward the volunteers already discussing distribution plans around the room. "Thank me when another little boy never has to believe that dinner belongs inside a dumpster." Adrian nodded quietly. For the first time since all of this had begun, he understood that the most important decision made that afternoon had not come from the chief executive officer of a billion-dollar company. It had come from a mother who refused to let her own hardship become someone else's future. The first Saturday of spring arrived carrying the gentle warmth that always seemed to erase a little of winter's memory. Long before sunrise, volunteers gathered behind the flagship store, laughing quietly as they organized fresh produce, bread, dairy products, and prepared meals into insulated containers instead of trash bins. The loading dock looked almost unrecognizable, where overflowing disposal carts had once waited in silence. Neatly labeled tables now stretched beneath white canopy tents. Every box carried a handwritten destination: family shelter, community kitchen, veterans center, neighborhood pantry. Danielle Brooks adjusted the reflective vest she now wore every weekend before checking the final delivery list clipped to her clipboard. She had accepted a permanent position coordinating the food recovery program several weeks earlier, balancing the job with her morning shifts at the laundromat. Life was still carefully budgeted. Bills still arrived every month. But now her work allowed her to solve the very problem that had once left her standing alone beneath security lights after dark. She looked toward the volunteers unloading crates of strawberries and smiled without realizing it. Micah hurried across the parking lot carrying a small cardboard box almost as large as his arms could manage. "Where does this one go, Mom?" he asked proudly. Danielle glanced at the label. "The Children's Shelter on Maple Street." Micah carefully placed the box beside the correct pallet before stepping back with visible satisfaction. "Then maybe another little boy gets strawberries too." Danielle rested her hand gently on his shoulder. "I hope so." Nearby, Mrs. Alvarez sat in a folding chair wrapped in her favorite blue sweater, happily greeting every volunteer who walked past as though the entire operation belonged to the neighborhood instead of a corporation. She pointed toward Micah with a proud smile. "That young man has become quite the supervisor." Micah laughed. "I am only helping." Mrs. Alvarez nodded knowingly. The people who change the most usually say exactly that. Across the dock, Adrian Cole finished helping two warehouse employees secure the final pallet inside the refrigerated truck. His expensive jacket had been replaced by a simple work coat, its sleeves lightly dusted with flour from moving bakery boxes earlier that morning. Laura approached carrying the newest quarterly report. "The board approved expansion into 3 more cities," she said quietly. Adrian accepted the folder but did not open it. Instead, he watched volunteers chatting while families collected groceries without embarrassment, paperwork, or whispered apologies. "Do you know what surprises me most?" he asked. Laura smiled. "That the stores still run just fine?" Adrian shook his head gently. "No, that we spent so many years believing compassion would be too complicated." The first truck eased away from the loading dock just as sunlight spilled across the pavement. No applause followed. No cameras waited. The moment felt too ordinary for headlines, yet somehow far more important than many ribbon cuttings Adrian had attended over the years. Ordinary mornings, he had learned, were where real change quietly chose to live. Before leaving, Danielle walked toward the old alley almost without thinking. The dumpsters still stood against the brick wall exactly where they always had, but they no longer carried the same meaning. They had become what they were always supposed to be, containers for waste instead of symbols of survival. She stood there only for a moment before Micah slipped his hand into hers. "Can I ask you something?" he said softly. "Of course." He looked toward the alley, then back at his mother. "Were you ever scared when you came here?" Danielle took a slow breath. She could have hidden the truth. Instead, she answered with quiet honesty. "Sometimes." "Then why did you keep coming?" He squeezed her fingers a little tighter. Danielle smiled, the morning light reflecting gently in her eyes. "Because loving someone is stronger than being afraid." Micah leaned against her side as they turned away together. Neither of them looked back. From across the parking lot, Adrian watched only long enough to see mother and son disappear around the corner before returning to help load the final delivery van. He did not call after them. He did not expect thanks. Some stories did not end with two people standing together. Some ended with each person walking forward carrying a little less weight than before. As the last truck disappeared into the awakening city, its shelves filled with meals instead of waste, Adrian quietly remembered his grandmother's words. "Nothing honest should ever make you feel small." For the first time in many years, those words no longer felt like a memory. They felt like the future. And somewhere beyond the morning traffic, a little boy who once believed strawberries came from a dumpster would grow up knowing they arrived because ordinary people had finally decided that dignity deserved a place at every table.